Some organizations focus on the next 3 to 5 years for their thought leadership, and other organizations focus much further out 20, 50, or even 100 years. In today's conversation, I sit down with Peter Griffiths, city strategist at Ing Media, and he's using his skills as a former investigative journalist and an academic to look into the far future to determine what specific cities might become. And what do they need to do today to get there? We'll be looking into the future and talking about the time horizons of thought leadership in this episode. I'm Bill Sherman, and this is Leveraging Thought Leadership. Ready? Let's begin. Welcome to the show, Peter.
Thank you, Bill. It's wonderful to be here with you.
So, you have an interesting title, city strategist, and you're doing thought leadership for cities. But the city itself, the physical buildings and space, are not the consumers of thought leadership. Who are you doing thought leadership for? Who are you trying to reach?
I think you're trying to always reach a range of audiences. So in some ways, you're right, the buildings don't consume the city, but people consume the buildings and they consume the spaces between the buildings. So you have people like you and me who are a target for how cities work and how they should work. Then you've got the big investors who spend money either directly or through developers to bring big new pieces of city online or to regenerate existing pieces of city. And then you have the cities themselves who are thinking about what it is that they want for their residents, what are the big global challenges that they're trying to solve, and how do all of these things fit together neatly to ensure that their city has profile and people want to visit it or learn in it or invest in it. So there's a broad range of people when it comes to cities, which is in many ways what makes them interesting.
Well, and I would assume a very complex process too. So before we dive into the work at hand, maybe you can help give an example of some of the thought leadership work that you've done and sort of the insights that you've gained through thought leadership around cities.
Yeah, I can definitely give that a go. I think the one thing that maybe if we start small. So imagine a developer or an investor is wanting to bring on a new piece of city and they're wanting to think about how do they not just think about the residential offer, how do they think about the commercial offer and the retail offer and how does it all fit together? And so you can create a piece of research of just talking to people who really understand where cities are going, asking them some questions around mixed use. So like, how do these different things come together? And then create a thought exercise of, well, if we know the trajectory was that 50 years ago, everything sat on its own. So the office sat on its own, the house sat on its own, retail was in its own building. Today, we're mixing it up a little bit. What could 50 years in the future look like? And so the opportunity was to create a thought exercise of, let's not position the developer in today. Let's give the developer an opportunity to think about what the trajectory might be in 50 years' time and to talk about that as a way of positioning themselves ahead of the curve. So that's at a small scale, trying to think about, well, how can somebody position themselves within time when they're not ahead of the curve yet? So there's an opportunity to use a thought exercise like that. But I think that kind of at the more macro scale is you have many cities around the world that are actually trying to say very similar things. So they're trying to say that they are, let's say, test beds for innovation. They have early adopter populations. They are sustainable, very livable. And so that when it comes to thought leadership in cities, what you're actually trying to do is stack a whole lot of pieces, which are actually quite similar when you look at them individually. But when you arrange them, you create something which makes a place recognizable. So ultimately, what you're wanting to do with thought leadership in cities is to take everything that's true about the city and sometimes almost rearrange it in a way that makes it easier to see what's actually happening in the city and makes it more, the idea of what the city represents, more accessible to target audiences.
So there's a bit of storytelling in that regard, because as you said, no one wants to tell a story that says, we're not very innovative here, we're a lousy place, there's an awful commute, etc. the quality of living is just awful, please don't come, whether it's business or tourists. So you have to paint those pieces in a story that's still rooted in the geography, culture, the community, and the experience, right?
Yeah, although just going back to your comment, I would love to do some kind of guerrilla campaign of please don't come here, because I suspect people would still come. But yes, answering your question, I think there's a lot of storytelling, but there's also curation. And I think that that's the bit about thought leadership that I find almost the most appealing, is it gives me the opportunity to just use my eyes. What is there? What is there to be seen in this place? And what is the opportunity for being creative with what's already there?
And so you talk about curation, and that goes to your background as a journalist. So let's connect the two between that asking questions and curation into the work that you do on thought leadership. How does your past serve you now doing thought leadership?
There are probably a few lessons that I can draw. So I used to work as a journalist, and I cut my teeth in many ways writing headlines for a daily newspaper. And for anyone thinking Twitter should be more generous with its character count, headline writing really teaches you to respect every word. And so the best content gets to the point quickly and does it clearly. So I think that's probably the first kind of benefit that I got as a journalist. I think I also worked for many years in television, and I benefited from having possibly one of the best executive producers in the business teaching me over and over again about storytelling, but not just about the script, also about how the images, the shot selection, the music, and even the time that the show, that particular story aired on television, all impacted on meaning. And so just this idea that it's not just about storytelling and it's not just about words, it's actually everything says something, everything has meaning. And so it's not just about being intentional about narrative, it's also about the curation and how things fit together to allow you to have a journey. So I think that that's probably a big part of using content to take people somewhere is a big part of thought leadership for me. And then I think probably something else that's really beneficial just in my journey is that I work between kind of the awkward gap between traditional media, so television and print, and the internet, and trying to figure out what the relationship was, trying to get content to work across both platforms or a range of different platforms, helped me to be quite format agnostic. So in the sense that I'm quite comfortable thinking of content as just something that needs to fit somewhere without being too governed by, what is the platform. It's more about what is the most efficient way to achieve delivery. And then I think, Bill, if you'd allow me to have a fourth point to go beyond the rule of sticking to threes, a fourth point. I think the last one is that I didn't actually do that much of my own writing. And even though writing is a really important skill that I would encourage people to learn how to write, it's a bit like drawing if you want to be an artist. But I did a lot of reviewing and editorial of other people's work. And in a sense, the big benefit of that is I slowly started realizing that certain things irritated me and I got much more comfortable with my own voice. And so I think when a lot of my background in a journalist has just taught me to be comfortable with my own voice and to know my own voice.
So, how did you make the jump between journalism and media and now thought leadership? Where where was that transformation and how did it happen?
Well, it was probably a slightly less clear jump than that. So I worked as an investigative journalist,
Hmm.
as it happened. And I realized that it wasn't really what I wanted to be doing. I enjoyed my job, but I kept gravitating towards cities and the built environment and wanting to tell stories about just cities. And so I left my position and I did an MSc in city design at the London School of Economics. And the big reason I did it at the London School of Economics is that they had a degree that's focused more on the social side of cities, which is more what I was interested in. I wasn't so much interested in the engineering, although I love bridges, I love tall buildings. I was more interested in, well, if we put those things on the ground, what do they say? And what does that mean for people's appreciation of place? And while I was studying, the benefit of my journalist background meant that I started doing some freelance work for the university, which then turned into a full-time job. So I spent 5 years helping a global program looking at the future of cities to create content from research. And slowly but surely, I got researchers more confident with the idea that I wasn't interfering with their independence by helping them with the research design stage to ensure that actually whatever piece of content was generated from their research had impact, whether it was a policy audience or a general audience. And so in a sense that you've kind of got perhaps the beginnings of thought leadership. How do you take something and get a lot more out of it, and a lot of translation work. And then but in many ways, I was still the journalist surrounded by a lot of city experts. So I couldn't really be the city expert. So I had to go back into comms where I could kind of do the full circle of now my colleagues are the comms experts. I can hang up my journalist hat and I can be the city's expert. And so in some ways, even though I went from effectively comms into academia and cities and back into comms, in that journey, I was able to flip the switch from being the more communications expert to being more of a cities expert.
Well, and I think one of the things that you point out there is expertise is also tied relative to place, right? So if you're surrounded by experts who are all doing the same thing that you are, you're not as distinctive. But if you start moving into an area where you are the one with expertise and you can rely on the expertise of others for other skills, then you bring something to the mix. One of the things that I go back to is you mentioned early on this sort of time frame of thinking 50 years ahead. And I know a lot of people who think about thought leadership and do thought leadership work, they're happy to be thinking 3 to 5 years ahead, especially if they're in tech, it may even be a shorter window, right? Whereas when you think about the history of cities, London, for example, you go to Romano Britain or you go even back to Iron Age, there's a history there that spans thousands of years already, right? And so you have this weight of context that drives the possibility of what the future can be.
Yeah, I think I've always had, I wouldn't call myself a futurist, but I've always had futurist tendencies in the sense of how does what we do today impact on what happens tomorrow? What is the consequence of our decisions today? And I think a lot of my interest in, if we call it thought leadership, it comes from actually I'm really curious about why the world works the way that it does. And if I'm able to make a different decision today as a thought exercise, what does it mean for the future? And you're right. The cities have such long arcs that you can't really say that a trend is happening over 3 to 5 years. There are a lot of people who do make predictions over 3 to 5 years, and I think it's incredibly brave to do so. And I'm not necessarily faulting the outputs of what they say. Often that can be really helpful for planning. But in some ways, you've got to know that you're kind of getting the wave pattern right. That are you really on an up or are you on a down? And I think for me, when I look at cities, I always try to look at a range of different time frames, both looking really far ahead, knowing that a big development can take 40 years to come online. So actually you do need to be thinking almost 50 years. But actually some of the big changes in cities have taken 100 to 200 years. So you really need to be thinking, maybe just as an example, China in some ways is a bit of an anomaly in that it seems to have brought cities online almost overnight. But even so, it's still taken 40 years. So you still need to be thinking about, what is the wider time period that has enabled change?
Well, and if you think about it, and I was thinking as you were talking, the history of American cities, for example, you go 200 years back, you've got a handful of cities on the North American continent that really qualify as cities. Whereas you go 200 years back in Europe, most of the cities that you're talking about today were there and were there long before, right? And so one of the things I think is there is an acceleration to the building of a city. But even as you said, 50 years in the lifetime of a city is a heartbeat.
Yeah, in many ways, I'd say that that's the case. I mean, I wonder if the acceleration is more that we have, it's kind of compound interest.
Mm-hmm.
We've been building cities for a long time. I mean, some people will say we've been building cities for close on 5 or 6,000 years. So
Mm-hmm.
we've had a lot of time to look and see how do you scale them up. And in some ways, the benefit of a country like China coming to the fore actually after Europe, after North and South America, they've had a lot of time to just see how to do it. But still, it's not something that's particularly quick.
Well, and I think this is interesting in thought leadership. It's about seeing around the corner into the future, but it's also standing on the work of others who have come before. And I think that's exactly what we're talking about, because we could go back to a settlement like Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, right? So, thousands of years at the dawn of civilization. And every accomplishment from there has built on each other in a cascade, small steps going forward. If you are enjoying this episode of Leveraging Thought Leadership, please make sure to subscribe. If you'd like to help spread the word about the podcast, please leave a 5-star review and share it with your friends. We are available on Apple Podcast, Spotify, and all major platforms, as well as at leveragingthoughtleadership.com. I think it's interesting, this something that you said, shifting the focus from the short term to the long term, between the 3 to 5 years to the 50 years. How do you do that shift?
If I'm entirely honest, I don't know. I think it's just something with how I think. And so, I mean, I suspect that there are just some people are just programmed a little differently. And I've always been able to move quite comfortably between a very narrow focus and a very broad focus. I found that transition quite comfortable to do. And actually, I found it quite helpful to just make sense of the world. And the same with time, in a sense, being able to think what is material to change and being able to discount, well, actually, if there's nothing material to change for next 5 or 10 years, actually, it's very easy then to say, well, let's look at 20 years and see if something is material to change. No, there isn't. Or actually, something interesting happens at 30 years potentially. Let's explore that. But I think it's one of those quirks just about how minds organize information, that in some ways, I guess I was just born with a mind that tries to make sense of patterns. And sometimes the patterns only resolve in the future.
One of the things, I think this is something that's transferable to others practicing thought leadership that you said, is that ability to say, what is true now, which will not be true in 3, 5, 10, 15, 50 years, right? And challenging your assumptions and saying, how might this change, or how do developments in other areas influence what I'm taking for granted?
I think that's probably one of the most fun things about what I do, is that I can be almost my own worst enemy in the sense that I can put forward proposals that are clearly a little bonkers and test them, which is quite fun. I mean, I'm not saying that I want to give people bad recommendations or bad content, but in a sense, part of the exercise is that creativity of being able to test things which seem ridiculous and maybe seeing that they're not so ridiculous, or testing something which seems common sense and realizing, oh no, there's no way that this is going to make sense to an audience in 20 years' time.
Go back to the 1880s or 1890s and tell someone that within 50 years, you'll be able to travel the Atlantic in a matter of hours. They would have blinked and said, that's crazy, right? And that changes the relationship between cities like London and New York instantly, overnight.
Yeah, but I suspect there it would have been asking the wrong question.
How so?
And so I think if you had been asking people, how do you feel about the fact that it takes you 6 weeks to cross the Atlantic? What do you feel it stops you from achieving all the things you want to achieve out of life? What if the crossing took 3 weeks? Would that change your decision about how often you crossed? what would the demand profile be then? And actually, if you could cross in a week, would the demand profile be 10 times as high? And all of a sudden, you've got an economic case for finding an innovation that achieves that. And so I think in some ways, we sometimes focus too much on the technology and not enough, or too much on the intervention and not enough on the need. I mean, maybe another way of putting this, when I was much, much younger, before we had Napster and digital music sharing legal, and now, I remember being really frustrated by how much space CDs took up. I remember thinking,
You
I don't
always
want these
carry this
things.
big book with
Yeah,
you, right? Yeah.
I don't want these things to take up so much space. And right there is a need for innovation.
Mhm.
Right there. If somebody could have captured that little bit of irritation and thought, oh, we need to find a way to save space in people's lounges or in their bedrooms. And so I think we often don't capture the inertia or almost the emotional side of change. We spend too much time thinking about what is the product that people might want.
When I hear you ask the question, and going back to the transatlantic piece, right? How would you feel? How would your life change if? I hear a bit of investigative journalism in there, right? Where you're poking and you're saying, how do you think? And you're trying to get into the head of the person. And I think that's something that becomes highly relevant in thought leadership, is that ability to go to the underlying need, like you said. So I was going to ask you, how do you define thought leadership based on your experiences, your work? If you were to explain it to someone, how would you describe it?
I wish I had a clear answer for you, Bill, because in some ways, I think a lot of the work around me that defines itself as thought leadership is really just opinion leadership. It's not
Mm-hmm.
necessarily saying something new. In some ways, I've also often been described as a researcher, and I'm not. I like new ideas and I like finding things out, but I wouldn't really call myself a researcher. And I think almost for me, the opportunity for thought leadership is it's what allows me to think differently about something, and then somebody else to think differently about that same thing. I think that it's a transaction. And so for me, I think thought leadership in some ways at its best is a transaction of ideas that impact both me and, let's say, the organizational client that I'm working with. It allows them to invest time and headspace in a journey to think differently about themselves, and then hopefully results in a piece of content that can then achieve the same to the outside audience or the particular target. So I think for me, thought leadership is very much about the opportunity for personal change before it's an opportunity for other people to change.
And I think there's an intensely personal piece to thought leadership. It has to be aligned with something that you're passionate about. So when you were telling a bit about your history and you said, okay, my investigative journalism, I enjoyed the work on cities, and that led to a graduate degree. And so you're able to look back and see what I would describe as the red thread that goes back in the connective tissue on the work. But there was something in real time pushing you forward. And I'd suggest that was a bit of passion. That internal work of what drives your curiosity is an essential piece for a thought leadership practitioner. Because if you're just phoning it in, it's really hard to do.
Yeah, I think there are probably a few things, Bill. So I grew up in South Africa, and
Mhm.
I don't know how much you know about South Africa, but South Africa had what was called apartheid spatial planning, which separated people by race groups. I know in the US, actually, you had similar policies. And basically, I grew up learning that you can really mess a city up if you want. You can completely destroy its ability to function properly. And I think rather than staying with being upset about that, the flip side is, well, that means you should be able to make them amazing. And so in some ways, a bit of my personal history is a passion to, if you can make cities bad, you should be able to make them good. So, that's maybe the underlying narrative or driver. But I think, yeah, as I've spent more and more time looking at cities, I think I've just realized that they are the space where people can connect. And if you can get them to do that, all of the other stuff, flows from that.
I hear connect again, just like you used connect in thought leadership, but that it's a relational piece between you and someone else, and it's a conversation. And I think that ongoing dialogue really leads to what is possible. Like you said, okay, if we can make a city lousy through redlining or blasting highways through places that are creating either economic or racial impact, we can also either undo that damage or we can think about ways to build better. And having that conversation and putting the conversation on the table is an important part, because if nobody's talking about it, things tend to go, their own way. Someone has to bang the table and say, no, there's another way to think about this.
Yeah, I think that you're right there, and I think that you're right there. And if I think about it clearly, there's no way of knowing for sure that you're right on something. There's no way of being 100% sure, I will give my life to this thought. But I think you can be confident about things, and you can increase your confidence and the confidence of those around you by having a conversation about what matters, and finding ways to, in just the same way you did now with the question, you repeated back my story, finding a way for people to see themselves over and over again so that they can make better choices about what they do next.
I want to ask you in terms about making better choices. So we have some listeners here who are at the start of the career for thought leadership, or they're thinking of going into thought leadership. I often joke that nobody went to school for this profession, but in the last couple of years, I've met people who have either taken a class in school or done an internship. What advice would you give someone starting out in a career thinking about thought leadership? Based on your experience, what have you learned that you would share forward?
Yeah, I think that that's a really good question, Bill. And I'm not sure that there's one blanket piece of advice, which in some ways I think is a good thing. But if I was to conjure up something, I think what it would be is along the lines of, I see some things that other people don't see. That's part of what makes me valuable. That's what makes me different. But that also means that I don't see things that other people see very clearly. A lot of the value that I add is being able to connect the two. It's being able to see what is it about the world that is very clear to me, whether it's patterns or the consequences of decisions we make today on the future, or it's connecting a story of cultural change to what's likely to come next. But I have to invest a lot of energy in understanding what is maybe a much more traditional read of what's happening around the world, and finding a way to talk in both languages and to bring the two closer together. And so I think that the world is kind of going through a transition where it's really wanting a lot more creative input. It's got a lot of really big problems to solve that traditional approaches aren't able to solve. And so thought leadership is almost certainly going to play a big part in that. But I think as people's confidence grows in what thought leadership can provide, and there's more space given to it, I think the biggest caution is to make sure that stays, that there's some kind of a connection to what's come before, that it's able to operate alongside what's already in the world, because ultimately it's the resources that are in the world that are going to need to work together to affect change. And so I think that's probably a bit of advice I would give.
Wonderful. I hear a few threads here. One, confidence in what you can see, humility and acceptance that there are many things that you will not see clearly, and then the willingness to collaborate and work with those who see those things that you cannot or do not see well.
Yeah, that you're saying it far more clearly than I did. You're definitely further along this journey than I am.
I wouldn't say that. I have the ability to listen while you're synthesizing what you say. So I think there's a lot that we could continue to say further, but let's leave it there. Thank you very much for joining today, Peter.
Thank you. It's been wonderful.
If you're interested in organizational thought leadership, then I invite you to subscribe to the OrgTL newsletter. Each month, we talk about the people who create, curate, and deploy thought leadership on behalf of their organizations. Go to the website orgtl.com and choose Join Our Newsletter. I'll leave a link to the website as well as my LinkedIn profile in the show notes. Thanks for listening, and I look forward to hearing what you thought of the show.